Have you ever noticed that some conversations seem to stay on the surface, while others quickly become surprisingly deep? What's interesting is that it often isn't because one person asked better questions. In fact, sometimes the conversation deepens precisely because they stopped asking questions and started reflecting. Imagine two conversations. Someone says, "I'm just exhausted." The other person replies, "Why? What's been happening? Have you tried taking some time off? Is work busy? Are you sleeping enough?" They're good questions. They're closed questions, like we mentioned in the last episode. They show curiosity. But after a while, it can start to feel a little like an interview. Now imagine a different response. "You've been carrying a lot for a long time." That's it. No question, no advice, just a reflection. And quite often, something remarkable happens. The other person pauses, takes a breath, and says, "Yeah, actually." Suddenly the conversation has gone somewhere new. In the last video, we explored the power of questions. Questions are incredibly important. They communicate curiosity. They show that we care. They invite people to talk. In many ways, questions get the conversation going. But today I want to suggest something that's well worth considering. Questions may open a conversation, but reflections deepen it. Here's a metaphor I've been thinking about. If listening were a car, questions get the car started and maybe even help to steer. They guide the conversation. They help us explore different directions. But reflections are the engine. They give the conversation its power. They create momentum. Without reflections, a conversation often stays on the surface. With reflections, it begins to move. Reflective listening sits right at the heart of Carl Rogers' work and later became one of the defining skills of motivational interviewing. Rogers said, "Reflections are more than repetition. They're like a revelation." And if you've ever watched an expert motivational interviewer, you might notice that they ask far fewer questions than you would imagine. Instead, they spend much of their time reflecting what they're hearing. Why? Because reflections do something questions can't quite do. Questions help us understand the other person. Reflections help the other person feel understood. These are two different things. I often say we listen for two reasons. We listen to understand, and we listen so the other person feels understood. Compassionate listening aims for both. So what exactly is a reflection? Well, it's pretty much what it sounds like. Imagine you're holding up a mirror. The other person says something, and rather than responding with another question or an opinion, you simply offer back what you've understood. Not necessarily their exact words, but the essence of what they've just said. Someone says, "I've had the busiest week I've had in months." You might simply reflect, "It's been completely full on." They say, "Exactly." Someone says, "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this." You reflect, "You're reaching your limit." Again, they nod. They keep talking. The conversation moves forward. Notice something important here. Reflections aren't parroting. You're not just repeating the last few words like an old tape recorder. You're listening carefully, making sense of what you've heard, and offering it back in your own words. It feels less like copying and more like showing someone the picture you think you're seeing. People sometimes worry that reflective listening will sound awkward or artificial. I certainly worried about that when I first learned about it. But what I've discovered over the years is that good reflections don't sound artificial at all. They sound essentially human. In fact, we use reflections naturally all the time. We just don't usually notice we're doing it. Listen to yourself next time you're having an ordinary old conversation. I bet you hear reflections in what you say. Imagine your partner comes home and says, "Traffic was absolutely shocking." You don't usually respond, "What time did you leave? Which road? How many cars were there?" You might simply say, "Sounds frustrating." That's a reflection. Or a friend says, "I've finally handed in my thesis." You smile and say, "What a relief." Again, you've reflected what you understood. So the first kind of reflection is what we might call a simple reflection. I like to think of it as an ordinary mirror. It reflects back what's already there. It doesn't add much. It doesn't interpret too far. It simply lets the other person see that you've heard and understood. Simple reflections are wonderfully underrated. Sometimes we think we need to say something clever. We don't. In fact, one of the biggest surprises for people learning motivational interviewing is discovering just how effective simple reflections can be. Let's look at a few examples. I've got so much on my plate. You've got a lot going on at the moment. My kids are driving me crazy. The kids have really been testing you. I haven't slept properly for days. Sleep's been really difficult. I don't think I'm ready. It doesn't feel like the right time yet. These simple reflections are basically saying, I'm here, I'm listening, keep talking. And although they're quite short and largely mirroring back what the person said, they can be very powerful. My kids are driving me crazy. The kids have really been testing you. Yes, that's exactly how I feel. A simple reflection can help people feel like finally someone understands them. Now here's something interesting. If all reflections did was mirror back what people already knew, they'd still be useful. People would feel heard, they'd feel less alone, they'd know someone was paying attention. But here's where reflective listening becomes something much more powerful. Because sometimes the mirror becomes magic. Imagine holding up a mirror that doesn't just show your face. It somehow reveals what's happening underneath. It helps you see things you hadn't fully noticed before. That's what a good, complex reflection can do. It doesn't invent something that isn't there. It simply shines a light on something that was already present, but perhaps only dimly recognized. Someone says, I keep saying yes to everyone, and then I end up stressed and resentful. A simple reflection might be, you've been saying yes a lot. And that's perfectly fine. But a complex reflection might sound like this. It's becoming harder and harder to find room for your own needs. Listen to how someone might respond. Yeah, actually, I don't think I've ever been considering my own needs. That insight didn't come just because you gave advice. It didn't come because you analysed the person. It came because your reflection helped them hear themselves a little more clearly. And that's one of the quiet miracles of reflective listening. The reflection isn't just helping the person feel understood, it's helping them understand themselves. When I'm listening compassionately, there are two questions present in my mind. The first is, what is this person feeling? The second is, what is this person meaning? Those two questions will take you a long way. Feelings and meaning. That's where compassionate listening often lives. Let's start with feelings. Most people naturally listen to the facts. They hear the story, they remember the details, they follow the sequence of events. Compassionate listeners certainly hear those things too, but they're listening for something else as well. They're listening for the emotional experience underneath the facts. Imagine someone says, my manager called me into the office this morning and spent half an hour going through everything I'd done wrong. There are lots of ways we might respond. What did you do? What was he unhappy about? Has this happened before? Or perhaps, managers can be like that. All of those responses stay connected with the facts. A reflection might sound very different. That really knocked your confidence. Or perhaps, you left feeling pretty deflated. Notice that we're no longer reflecting the event. We're reflecting the emotional impact of the event. Here's another example. My daughter hasn't called me in 3 weeks. The facts are simple. 3 weeks, no phone call. Our minds immediately want to solve the problem. She's probably busy. Why don't you give her a call? Young people aren't very good at keeping in touch. But a reflection sounds different. You're really missing her. Or, that hurts. Or perhaps, you're wondering whether you've slipped out of her life a little. Can you feel the difference? One response tries to solve the situation. The other simply joins the emotional experience. And here's something fascinating. Very often, once people feel understood emotionally, they're much more able to think clearly about what to do next. Understanding usually comes before problem solving, not after it. Sometimes the feeling is obvious. I'm terrified about tomorrow. You're really frightened. Easy enough. But often the feeling is only implied. I've been lying awake every night thinking about the meeting. You've been carrying a lot of anxiety. Or it's been hard to switch your mind off. Again, we're not inventing anything. We're simply putting words around what seems to be there. It's a bit like offering a hunch. And here's a tip that took me years to appreciate. You don't have to be right. That surprises people. They think reflective listening is about getting the perfect reflection every single time. It isn't. It's about offering your best understanding, knowing that the other person is free to correct you. In fact, some of the richest conversations begin with an imperfect reflection. Suppose someone says, I don't know, I just feel flat. You respond, it sounds like you're disappointed. They reply, no, not disappointed, more empty, I think. That's wonderful. Your reflection wasn't wrong. It helped them find a better word. Remember the magic mirror? That's exactly what's happening. Your reflection is helping the other person clarify their own experience. They aren't simply agreeing with you, they're discovering something. This is one of the reasons reflective listening is so powerful in therapy, coaching, leadership, parenting, friendships. The conversation isn't moving forward because the listener is brilliant. It's moving forward because the listener has created a space where the speaker can hear themselves. Now let's go one step further. Reflective listening isn't only about feelings, it's also about meaning. And this, I think, is where reflections become truly beautiful. Imagine someone says, my daughter hasn't called me in 3 weeks. We've already reflected the feeling, you're really missing her. But now we might ask ourselves another question. What does this situation mean? Perhaps it means your relationship with your daughter is incredibly important to you. Or staying connected as a family really matters. Or part of what makes this so painful is just how much you love her. Notice what's happened. We're no longer simply reflecting the emotion, we're reflecting what sits underneath the emotion. Meaning, values, identity, relationships, what matters most. People are rarely moved by someone understanding the facts. They're moved by someone understanding what the facts meant for them. Let's try another example. I didn't get the promotion. A feeling reflection might be, you're disappointed. That's a powerful reflection. A meaning reflection might be, you've worked incredibly hard and that's really mattered to you. Or, you wanted your efforts to be recognized. Or even, you expected more from yourself. Those reflections don't just name the feeling, they begin to touch the hopes and values underneath it. Here's another. I've been spending every weekend looking after mum. Feeling reflection? You're exhausted. Meaning reflection? Being there for your family is deeply important to you. Or perhaps you've been trying to carry this because you love her. Suddenly, the conversation changes. We're no longer just talking about tiredness. We're talking about love. That's often where the deepest conversations live. As compassionate listeners, we're listening beneath the surface. We're listening for values, for hopes, for fears, for identity, for belonging, for loss, for love. Because those are often the things that people are really talking about, even when they don't yet have words for them. And when someone hears a reflection that captures not only how they feel, but what their experience means, something very special often happens. They pause. Sometimes they nod. Sometimes they smile. Sometimes they cry. Not because you've said something profound, but because perhaps for the first time in a while, they feel truly seen. And that's the real magic of the mirror. It doesn't tell people who they are, it simply helps them see themselves a little more clearly and fully. So far, we've talked about simple reflections and more complex reflections that capture feelings and meaning. But here's something that's both exciting and a little daunting. As listeners, we also get to decide what we reflect. That might sound obvious, but it's actually one of the most powerful ideas in reflective listening. Imagine someone says, I'm terrified of leaving this job. but I also know I can't keep doing it. There are at least two equally true things in that sentence. You could reflect, you're terrified of making the wrong decision, or you could reflect, part of you knows something has to change. Both are accurate. Neither is manipulative, but each one is likely to invite a different response. Reflective listening doesn't simply follow conversations. It shapes them, not by telling people what to think, but by deciding which part of their experience to hold up in the mirror. I sometimes compare it to shining a torch in a dark room. The room doesn't change. Everything is already there. But wherever you point the light is where people naturally begin looking. Or perhaps it's like watering a garden. What you water tends to grow. The same is true in conversation. What you reflect is often what people go on to elaborate. Here's another example. I'm exhausted looking after Dad, but I'd feel guilty if I stopped. You might reflect, looking after him has really taken its toll. Or, your sense of responsibility runs very deep. Or, part of you desperately needs a rest, and another part of you couldn't imagine letting him down. Each reflection invites a slightly different path. There isn't always one perfect reflection. There are simply different doors you can open. Now let's look at a few special kinds of reflections. The first is called a double-sided reflection, and I think these are wonderful whenever someone feels torn. Most of us have experienced that feeling. Part of me wants this, another part wants that. Someone says, I really want to stop drinking, but I honestly enjoy it with my mates. Rather than taking sides, we simply reflect both. Part of you enjoys the social side of drinking, and another part is becoming increasingly worried about what it's costing you. Nobody's been judged, nobody's been persuaded. Their ambivalence has simply been understood. Compassion often begins by making room for both sides. Although the listener is making a subtle choice there, swapping the order of the two sides in the reflection. Did you notice that? I really want to stop drinking, but I honestly enjoy it with my mates. Part of you enjoys the social side of drinking, and another part of you is becoming increasingly worried about what it's costing you. When we reflect two ideas, the one we place last often carries a little more weight. Suppose someone says, I'm scared of changing jobs, but I know I can't stay where I am. You could reflect, you know you can't stay, and that's really frightening, or it's really frightening, and you know you can't stay. The first version, putting the fear second, leans more into validating that fear, rather than guiding towards change. The second version quietly leaves the conversation resting on possibility rather than fear. It's a tiny difference, but tiny differences can shape where conversations naturally flow. Another kind of reflection is the amplified reflection. This one can sound a little strange at first, but used gently and often with a little humour, it can be surprisingly effective. Imagine someone says, I'm always procrastinating. You smile and respond, so you've basically decided never to start anything ever again. They'll often laugh. No, it's not that bad. I just get stuck sometimes. Notice what happened. The reflection invited them to clarify. Here's another. Exercise isn't really for me. You really don't like exercise at all. Again, they might soften. Well, actually, I do like walking. The amplified reflection encourages people to move towards a more balanced position. Related, but in the other direction, is the minimizing reflection. Imagine someone says, I've completely ruined everything. You respond, things haven't gone quite how you hoped. Very often they'll reply, yeah, I just wish some things had turned out different. Again, the person naturally moves towards a more balanced description. Although sometimes you might use a minimizing reflection to see whether the person doubles down on what they said. For example, they say, I think I will call her this week. You respond, you're considering making that call. And they say more emphatically, oh no, it's time. I'm going to do it for sure. None of these reflections are about winning arguments. They're about helping people hear themselves. Now, here's something I wish someone had told me when I first learned reflective listening. You don't always need those reflection stems. It sounds like, so what I'm hearing is, if I'm understanding this correctly. Those phrases certainly have their place. They soften reflections. They communicate humility. They invite correction. Sometimes that's exactly what's needed. But sometimes they also just get in the way. Imagine someone says, I just wish I had someone there, someone I could call. Compare these two responses. It sounds like you're feeling lonely versus simply, you're just so lonely. Sometimes the second lands with much more warmth and presence, not because it's more accurate, but because it sounds less like a counseling technique and more like one human being understanding another. Of course, if you're uncertain, soften it. It sounds like, I'm wondering if, I have a sense that. Reflective listening isn't about pretending certainty. It's about offering understanding. The reflection stems are part of the skill, and sometimes we use them and sometimes not. But understanding is the key. Let's put all of this together. Imagine your friend says, I've been thinking about leaving my job. Instead of asking another question, you reflect. Something's changing for you. Yeah, I just don't know if I can keep doing it. You're reaching your limit. I am. But I also feel terrible because everyone's counting on me. You don't want to let people down. Exactly. I've always been the reliable one. Being dependable is part of who you are. Yes, and I don't even know who I'd be if I wasn't. Part of this isn't really about changing jobs. It's about the kind of person you really want to be. Long pause. I hadn't thought about it like that. Notice something? There were no questions. Certainly no advice or problem solving. No clever interpretation. Just careful listening. The conversation deepened because each reflection gently invited the speaker to keep exploring. To me, that's one of the most beautiful things about reflective listening. People often think listening is passive. It isn't. You're working, paying attention, following emotional threads, listening beneath the words, trying to understand not only what's happening, but what it means to this particular person. And this brings us back to compassion. In compassion-focused therapy, compassion begins with what we call compassionate engagement. It's the willingness to turn towards suffering rather than away from it, to notice it with sensitivity, to be emotionally moved by it rather than shutting it out, to stay present even when it's difficult, to try to understand the other person's experience with empathy rather than judgment, and to hold their well-being in mind as something that genuinely matters. Reflective listening embodies every one of those qualities. It's one of the clearest, most practical examples of compassionate engagement I know. But compassion doesn't stop there. It also involves compassionate action, doing something that is genuinely helpful. What's fascinating is that reflective listening is already compassionate action, not because it gives advice or fixes problems, but because it helps people organize their own experience. It helps them make sense of confusing emotions. It helps them clarify what matters. It helps them discover strengths they hadn't recognized. It helps them hear themselves. And when people begin understanding themselves more clearly, wise, helpful action often follows naturally. Sometimes the most compassionate thing we can offer isn't an answer. It's understanding. Questions tell someone, I'm interested in you. Reflections tell someone, I understand you. And the deepest reflections communicate something even more powerful. You matter. Your experiences are valid. You make sense. Perhaps that's one of the greatest gifts we can offer another human being, to help them feel heard, to help them feel understood, and every now and then to hold up a mirror that helps them see themselves just a little more clearly.